Hello, everyone. Welcome to the November meeting of the Barbados Genealogy Group. This is, in fact, our final meeting for 2021. We greet all the participants in the Zoom and those who are joining us on Facebook Live. My name is Harriet Pierce, and I'm the coordinator for the Barbados Genealogy Group, which has been in existence from 2014. Today, we welcome Dr. Patricia Stafford to our forum. She will speak on the topic, The Ancestors You May Prefer Not to Know, Barbadian Captains and Owners of Slave Ships. A very provocative title, I must say. About our talk, this presentation has been inspired by a project undertaken by Dr. Stafford earlier this year for the website www.slavevoyages.org, which has been online since 2008. She was asked to trace as many as possible of the slave ship owners and captains sailing into Barbados from the African coast and find which were Barbadian or had close connections to the island. Some did, and she will tell us about them. Dr. Stafford, Pat, has undertaken a great deal of genealogical research in the island and is a founder member of this group. I remember back in 2012, when she and I started a series of basic workshops for persons interested in genealogical research. And this group came out of those initial workshops. Pat wrote her doctoral thesis on the growth of the Black Barbadian middle class. Subsequently, she has had several articles published in the Journal of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, and is a joint author of the book Halls, Hills, and Holes, The Place Names of Barbados, edited by Sir Woodville Marshall and published by the museum. And this is a must for family history researchers. Before we hear from Pat, let's do a little housekeeping. We want you to hold your questions until the end of the presentation, and then you can type your question into the Q&A or just use the raise hand feature. If you just have a comment, use the chat for that. Pat, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for asking me to make this presentation, which today really has two objects. One is to show people more of the Slave Voyages website to those who haven't really explored it before. And the other important point of the presentation is to advise you about the ancestors that you may not want to find. Many people in Barbados are of mixed ethnicity. Some people can tell by the color of their skin. Others may not know until they actually do a DNA test and discover that they either have some African or some European DNA that they really have no idea about. And sometimes this can be quite traumatizing. A friend of mine had a white granny, and he decided that she was probably from the poor whites from the East Coast in Barbados, until he traced her ancestors and discovered that his fifth great-grandfather was a plantation owner who owned 227 enslaved people. He was not very happy about this. It was quite a shock to him. So I am warning you not to be shocked if you do find something in your ancestry that is surprising. But I have to say, there are some ancestors probably who are even worse to find than others. And the ones who are probably the ones you really don't want to find are the slave ship captains and owners who sailed from Barbados and have Barbadian connections. That's Harriet Pierce here. Many of us have been taught about the transatlantic slave trade and have been led to understand that most of the slave ships that sailed out of Britain were captained by British people, owned by British people. They went to the African coast. They took what Walter Rodney called guns and assorted rubbish, traded them with African people on the coast, and then bought slaves with the proceeds and sailed across the sailed across the Atlantic to the Caribbean islands. This obviously is not the case, because in fact we know now that many Barbadians were involved in the slave trade as well. I got involved with this slide. I got involved with this program, as Harriet said, when I was asked to look at the genealogies of some of the people who were listed on the slave voyages website. Yes, slide, please. And we're going to show you an example of several of the things that you can find from the website. I'm just waiting for the slide to come up. This particular slide you can see now shows voyages that ended at Barbados. The next slide will show us voyages that originated in Barbados. And the people on this particular list were some of those that I was asked to look into their origins to see whether in fact they were actually Barbadian people. What did I find? Well, quite a lot of them were. This website actually has about 36,000 transatlantic voyages. So we know everything is not here at the moment. And we know that the genealogies of quite a few people who were involved have still got to actually be put on the website. It's an active website that people are putting new information on all the time. And we're hoping that the information about the people from Barbados will be put up early next year. In the meantime, I need to tell you something about them. Now, of course, next slide, please. Oh, here we have another example of the sort of material that you can find. Thomas Newton was one of the slave traders who did work out of Barbados, and here we can find a list of the voyages that he actually made. Next slide. Right. Just to recap about the transatlantic slave trade. We know, of course, that in the 14th century, the Portuguese started visiting the African coast to trade in gold and in human beings, which they took to Portugal, and gradually to islands such as São Tomé, where they had established sugar plantations. They then went to colonize Brazil and started taking African enslaved people to Brazil. By the next century, the African slave trade was growing fast. Other Europeans wanted to get into it. In the early 1600s, the Dutch became involved as well. And when the British decided to colonize various Caribbean islands, such as Barbados, they also got involved in slave ship voyages. It has been estimated that from 1662 to 1713, over 156,000 enslaved Africans were brought to Barbados on slave ships alone. That is a lot of people. Now, to start with, the Barbadian people were actually growing, well, the early settlers were growing tobacco and cotton and a little sugar, but they were mostly using the sugar to feed the animals. There had been no particular evidence of settlers in Barbados at that time, although there was lots of evidence that Amerindian people had previously lived on the island. So the early settlers brought their own staff, so to speak. They brought servants from Britain. Some of them were actually criminals, some were homeless people, but many of them were indentured servants who were brought to the island for a period of several years, paid a basic wage, and at the end of that process was supposed to be given a piece of land. But as the sugar revolution occurred in the 1640s, the land was rapidly bought up by planters. There was no land to give indentured servants, and that Barbados had got a bad name in Britain because of the way the servants had been treated. It was hot, they were worked hard, sometimes not fed very well, and often died before the end of their indentures. So the settlers then decided that they would copy the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the other slave shippers. They would start becoming involved in the African slave trade. There was a company in Britain called the Royal African Company that was supposed to have had the monopoly on slave trading, but in fact, they didn't keep their monopoly for very long. After about 1672, they started to have finance issues, and more independent slave traders became involved in the trade. Between 1666 and 1713, we know that about 200 ships actually sailed directly from the Caribbean to the African coast, most of them from Barbados, and they were carrying rum. By that time, the sugar industry had developed to the point where Barbadian rum was becoming sought after. People in Africa bought rum, and again, with the profits, the captains of the ships and the owners bought slaves and brought them back to this island. I think the next, please. Right, so how did I go about finding who was a Barbadian and what did I find? First of all, these are the fact-finding sources that I used. The parish registers were very helpful. Well, particularly St. Michael Parish Register. Many parish registers, of course, for that period have been lost. But most of the slave ship captains and owners that I did find were based in St. Michael anyway, because of course Bridgetown was a large port. There were also ports in Speightstown and Oyston, and I had to look at other sources to see what I could find for the people who might have lived in different areas. So apart from the parish registers, which in fact often if a person was married or was buried and was a mariner or a seaman or a ship captain, in those days they actually often told you that, which was really helpful. But there was also the genealogies of the West Indies database to be consulted, which is kept at the Museum Library. And if the person was a ship owner particularly, James Brando's book, The Genealogies of Barbadian Families, often gave quite a lot of information of these rather more, should we say, upmarket people. I've also noted that I've made some additional material that I used relating to people I will tell you towards the end of this presentation. So next slide, please. And what did I find? Well, of 375 names on my list, I found data on 143 captains and slave ship owners linking them to Barbados. The first step, of course, was to find the evidence of birth, marriage, and burial. And I also looked at the wills. I looked at the wills because I wanted to know what sort of profits these people had made. For the wills, it was actually quite useful to use Joanne Sanders' 3 volumes of Barbadian wills, which run from 1680 to 1725. A lot of the slave ships ran between those periods, and there were 54 people on my list who had actually left wills. However, Mrs. Sanders' wills only actually give you the descendants. So I then went to the Barbados Department of Archives and was able to read the whole wills, which told me about the amount of property that people had left. And I also looked at the wills outside that period from the RB 644-1 index of wills. So that took me up to 1800, and the names on my list had actually run from 1645 to 1800. So that covered the area that I was looking at. Now, first, the next thing I found that I looked at were the slave ship captains. And one of the things that did surprise me here was the age of the captains. A lot of them were very young. If the data is correct, John Foster made his first voyage as a slave ship captain at the age of 21, and Jonathan Franklin and Simon Welsh were 22. While the rest of them, whom I could find baptismal dates from the parish records, another 24 were under the age of 30. Now, some of these young men might have been related to slave ship owners or merchants and had started in the slave ship trade as early as the age of 14. But of course, it wasn't a trade for the soft-hearted. We know that people were crammed into these ships. They were shackled down. They were hosed down because there was no other sanitation. They were badly fed and had the minimum amount of water because the ships all needed to carry drinking water. And when they got to the destination, they were sold in the slave markets. And it seems to me that quite a number of these younger people dropped out of the trade fairly early. Some of them obviously carried on for years and years and years. And it seems to, well, the motives were obviously profit. Everybody who was in this business was in it for the profit. But the young men often seemed to marry shortly after their last voyage. And probably bought themselves a small piece of land or set themselves up in another trade. I'm talking about men because on the whole list, I only found one woman. Her name was Suzanne Minviel, and she actually inherited half a slave ship when her husband died. Her husband and her son had actually owned this ship. And she was an interesting woman because I'm still trying to work out her religion. When she died, she said in her will that she wanted to be buried at 9 o'clock at night with no mourning rings and no burning wine. Now, I don't quite know what religion she was, but the religion of most of these people was very interesting. Most of them were Anglicans, but one of them, Joseph Harbin, was Quaker. Quakers were in the 1680s, 1660s to 1680s, were quite common in Barbados, but they refused to be involved with the militia, the local militia that was set up to defend the island, because they were pacifists. Now, Joseph Harbin, in 1675, actually paid twice fines because he refused to send his servants to the militia, and yet at the same time he did not have any problem about buying and selling human beings. And then there was another captain who was a Jewish man called Joseph Barrow. He was related to the Baruch family in Barbados, who changed their name to Barrow. And when he died, he left a will demanding that he was buried in the Jewish fashion in a vault at Whitechapel in London. But most of the people I say were actually Anglicans, because at that time most of the people in Barbados professed the Anglican religion, but at least the white people did. And if you read wills from that period, you will often see that there was a clause that said something along the lines of, I wish my body to be interred into the earth and my soul united with Almighty God. Sometimes there was quite a long piece of this sort of writing before we actually got to the actual will. But how did this actually affect the whole religion? Again, it's one of these mysteries that we can't quite understand in this day and age. And needless to say, the slave owners who did leave wills did actually leave quite a lot of property. In the mid-1600s, as we know, the sugar trade was booming, especially in Barbados, and this is how Barbados became to be known as the jewel in the British crown. The planters needed more land, they needed to plant more land, they needed to make more sugar, they needed to make more rum, and therefore they needed more labour. And they needed, because they couldn't get labour from anywhere else, they needed to buy labour from Africa. The Africans who were brought here and enslaved on the plantations were treated very badly. They had poor diets, they worked hard in the hot sun, they had, as like still happens, they suffered from all the pests that we get in the tropics, but they also suffered from sort of illnesses that these days we know how to treat and keep people alive. So there was a regular turnover of enslaved people because they kept dying, and the slave ship owners started to make absolute fortunes. They also, of course, because they were very wealthy and their services were needed by the planters, they also became very, very important to the country and had a lot of political power. Let's talk about one or two of these people. Right, I'm sorry, I've just realised I did start to talk about age and sex and religion, and I think we've actually covered that. But now I'm going to tell you about three of these slave ship owners, Richard Walter, John Hallett, and George Lillington. And you will understand what I mean about their influence in this country over the political landscape. And not just in this country, but also in England. Because when Barbados was still very much a fledgling English colony, the English sent a governor to take charge of the island, but the planters effectively ran it with a council and an assembly which was composed entirely of very wealthy white men who were planters. So we had this system whereby the council had a lot of power in passing legislation and insisted on legislation. Now, Richard Walter was a merchant, he's a slave ship owner and a donator of the fonts in St. James's Parish Church in 1685, which suggests that he did care about the eternal life and what was going to happen to him in his future. he had bought 16 acres in St Andrew in 1679, and after that he added property to the 16 acres until he finally, before his death in 1698, had built up a plantation of 600 acres, which we know as Apes Hill. He had a slave ship, and his son John had a slave ship. His son John had inherited all Richard Walter's property when he died, which included not only the 600 acres at Apes Hill, but also 5,000 acres in South Carolina and some property in England, which had belonged to the family, presumably before they had started to settle in Barbados. John Walter went back to England and settled back in England after his father died, and he became a member of the British Parliament. Now, I haven't actually seen the records of what he actually said in the British Parliament, but I think we can safely assume that he was speaking up for Barbados and the planters in the Caribbean, rather than the enslaved people who were working on the plantations, and enforcing the sort of legislation that would help Barbados become a very racist society. The second person I would like to talk about is John Hallett. Now, if you want a real rogue and vagabond, John Hallett was there. He was living in Barbados, sorry. Oh, it's this one, sorry. He was living in Barbados by 1660, and he was practicing as a merchant again. And he was said that year to have a great storehouse. What he had in the storehouse, we're not quite sure, whether it was enslaved people, whether it was smuggled brandy. We really don't know. He certainly had a plantation at Black Rock. And this plantation was the one that became known as Cave Hill Plantation. Those of you who know Barbados will know that Cave Hill starts above where the university is now, and runs all the way. This plantation ran all the way back down to the sea, somewhere near Pile Bay. So it's not particularly good land for growing sugar, but nevertheless, John Walter was doing very well for himself, because he did have a slave ship, and we know that in 1677 he landed 122 enslaved people, presumably on his property. By March 1677, he had purchased more land in St Michael, and by the time of the 1679-80 census, his holdings had mushroomed to 220 acres. He also bought in 1680 another plantation in St John, also known as Hallett's. Now, what else was he doing? He was benefiting from his connection with the militia. He joined the militia and actually was given a project to go overseas and obtain material for the militia. How much money he made out of that, we don't really know, because there aren't any particular records left. But he was also probably because of this, became a member of the Barbados Assembly. He was made a member of the Barbados Assembly, and he became known as the Honourable John Hallett. Now, the Assembly decided that because there were wars going on in the Caribbean, the French and the English were more or less permanently at war during this period, flanking over various islands, and the Assembly decided that they needed to ensure that the defences of the island were safe. So they devised a programme where they sent a government official to look around at where the new defences were needed. And Mr. Allen went to John Hallett's property to gain entry, to have a look at what was going along the seaside. And John Hallett sent, although he'd agreed to this in the assembly himself, John Hallett sent his servant to refuse Mr. Allen entry. Mr. Allen persisted. John Hallett came out of his house and he thumped Mr. Allen across the face. Well, he was actually suspended from the assembly for 3 months as a punishment, but he appealed, and it was decided that, in fact, this was a far too severe punishment, and he was re-elected to the assembly, and despite the fact that he was still known to be illegally landing people, because he landed 78 more people that year, he was actually allowed to go back on the assembly, and he was back in the assembly by 1898, and became not just a member of the assembly, but a member of the ruling council. The other person I'd like to tell you about was George Lillington. Now, if we are talking about rogues and vagabonds. Oh, sorry, but before I leave John Hallett, I must remind you that he was also a wealthy man up to his death in 1698, and he had enough money to leave an estate in Axmouth, Devon, as well as the dwelling house in Bridgetown, his 2 plantations in St. Michael and St. John, considerable legacies to friends, and even charity to the poor whites of the parish of St. Michael. Now, the other person I want to tell you about, as I said, is George Lillington. George Lillington was an army man. He was in the military, and he fought in Jamaica in 1694. He then came to Barbados, and he too became a member of the ruling council. Now, in 1703, the British government sent a different governor to Barbados, a man called Sir Bevel Granville, who didn't really get on with the members of the council. There was a divide in the council as to whether the members were prepared to go along with Granville's desires or not. George Lillington was obviously one of those who did not agree with the governor, and in 1705 he went down the road to Government House, which was where it is now at Pilgrim, and saw the governor sitting in the window. What did he do? He took out a gun and he shot at the governor. He didn't kill him, but he did shoot him, and obviously, probably as you and me would, the governor was very upset. Now, George Lillington for this was fined £2,000. A lot of money in those days. But by 1710, George Lillington had so much power and influence because of his ability to bring the labour necessary to the country. He actually became president of the council. So, some people, well, quite a lot of us, I suppose, when we're looking for our ancestors, we might like to find somebody who is wealthy or famous or has done something interesting. So I think the moral of this story is, please just beware of what you might wish for. Okay, thank you very much.
you very much, Pat. We will open the floor now for any questions. Let's see. Okay, Pat, we don't have any questions or comments as yet. Is there anything else about these guys you will want to mention? Or even about the fact that Barbadians were not just passive recipients of slave voyages, but were actively engaged in slave trading. Oh, I think, yeah, sorry. Okay, we have a question. Okay, we actually have a question from David O'Carroll. Yes. I asked, did Barbadian captains go to particular parts of the African coast? Did you find them going to particular parts of the African coast?
Yeah, yes, my brief, yes, I have to say, first of all, make it clear, my brief was to look at the people who departed specifically from Barbados. But if you look at, there's a book called The Rise of African Slavery in the Americas by Professor David Eltis. And he gives quite a wide description of where enslaved people came from at various points in the history of the slave trade. And he talks about, first of all, there were a number of slave traders who went to the part of the African coast which is immediately north of what is now Ghana, the area around Senegal. But apparently there were problems about buying enslaved Africans there. And also the people who actually lived there were quite sort of tall, hefty people who were not easy to capture, in other words. So the most of the people who came during this period to Barbados actually came from the area around what is now Ghana, Benin, and Nigeria. Now, if you look on the actual slave trade voyages website, you will be able to see where all these voyages, if you can, where all these voyages actually started out from as they left the African coast. So this website is quite a big website, and it's not necessarily very easy to find your way around when you start. But if you persist, you will be able to find maps as well as to where all the voyages came from, and there are the dates of the voyages that came from the coast to the Caribbean, and hopefully will give you some idea of where our Barbadian ancestors from Africa actually came from. I'm sorry I can't be more clearer than that, because as I say, it was not quite the brief I was given, but the website will tell you probably everything you need to know, I hope. Thank you.
Okay, we have a couple more questions here. One from Reverend Johnson, who wants to know what was the last year that Barbadians were involved.
Right, thank you. I can't tell you the last year that Barbadians were actually involved, but the list that I was sent with Barbados, with names of people who may be Barbadians, were actually finished in 1799. Now we do know that the African slave trade was not prohibited until 1807. So whether there were other people participating during those 7 years who were actually Barbadians, I do not know. But we have to remember, of course, that by that time, Barbados was in a position where the people who had been enslaved, who were actually reproducing themselves. So John Gay Allen, who was a well-known person who ran the council for a number of years, actually wrote to someone in the 1780s when the abolition of the transatlantic trade slave was being discussed. And he said, it doesn't really affect the people in Barbados because we have enough people here anyway, but it will affect the newer colonies like Demerara. So it may be that very, very few slave traders felt that there was now any profit or any great profit in actually landing enslaved people in this country. But that is not definitive. I don't really know what happened during those 7 years. Does that help? I hope so.
Okay, thank you, Pat. We have another question from Cynthia Cumberbatch. She mentions that it's a very interesting presentation, and she wants to know if you found any evidence of relationships that developed between the ship's captains and Black women.
I'm afraid that's one thing that the slave voyages website doesn't tell you. Although I do have to say there were certainly slave ship owners who developed relationships with Black women. There were 3 brothers from Ireland called Alexander, David, and George Hall, who actually owned Springfield and Locust Hall properties in Barbados. They married, one of them married local women, a local woman, but Alexander, in his will, actually left a considerable amount of property to someone he described as his mulatto woman. So I think this suggests that he actually had a relationship with her, but not on a slave ship, but on the plantation, one of the plantations that he owned. Is that helpful? I hope so. I don't know of any other instances because, as I say, it's not something that I actually had to look into on this particular occasion. But it's if you want the reference, Cynthia, it's in James Brando's book, and under Alexander Hall. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Facebook, Albert Williams. He said, yesterday I found out that a slave trader freed a domestic slave named Louis upon his death. How would you suggest that person to research more about the enslaved Africans?
I think yes. Do you know the name of this the slave trader who freed? If you know the name of the person who actually freed this person, one possible thing you could do is look for the will. Look for the will of the slave trader and see what see who he left his legacy to. It is not uncommon to find wills in Barbados where a planter who may or may not have been a slave trader has actually had a relationship with one or more people on his plantation and left their land and property. I think the most famous example is Jacob Hines, who in the early 1800s died, and he had managed to have 6 what you might call outside families, enslaved women who he'd had children with, and he left each woman and the children a piece of property. And in fact, there's been quite a lot of research being done in this area. And in fact, if you look at my article in the 2020 Museum Journal, you will find that I actually wrote an article about several other people who also benefited from being in a relationship with one of the white community who had property. Okay.
Thank you very much, Pat. I don't see any other questions or comments. So I will give you the final word. You can, anyone who wants to leave for our audience.
Right, okay. For my final word, thank you for taking an interest in this subject, and I hope it's been enlightening. But there is just one small thing I missed out when I was giving the presentation, and I was talking about religion and and whether people had any regrets. Most people didn't seem to, but there were two people who were outstanding in their wills. One was William Sims, who exhorted his family to be good Christians. Now, did he feel guilty? I don't know. And the other person was William Davis, and William Davis actually asked God to forgive him for his sins. And his will was quite interesting, because I don't know whether it was because he didn't, he wanted to be forgiven for his sins because of what he had done, or because he'd just been unlucky, because he wasn't one of the, he hadn't actually died at sea like several of the ship's captains, but he had returned to Barbados and not landed any enslaved people. So what went wrong there? I don't know. So there's a lot more to be found out on this subject, and I hope it will interest people enough to explore the Slave Voyages website. Thank you very much, everybody.
Actually, Pat, we have a couple questions.
Yes.
Very quickly, we have one from Marcy the nurse. She asked, did your research examine the local whites who may have had part ownership in ships transferring the enslaved from Barbados to the southern and eastern seaboard?
To the southern
associates who ventured there to plunder those lands?
No. My research really only looked at the people who actually did own the slave ships during that period, and their genealogies. So I think there's something else there that obviously needs to be looked at. Thank you.
What I can mention for Marcia is that the website itself also has a section which looks at intra-American trade.
That's true. Yeah.
Right. Yes. So although that might not have been passed in it, you can check the website. We have one last question from Reverend Johnson. He wants to know if you came across the name Boyles.
Boyce?
Boyles.
Boyce.
Not Boyce, Boyles.
Boyles. I have a feeling that I did, but I'm afraid I have to say, out of the 372 names, I can't remember them all. Now, so I can't answer this question straight away, but when this material is put up on the website, I've been promised that it should be there probably in January. If you would like to check the website, you may well find that there is somebody of that name. If in the meantime you're desperate to know, if you'd like to email me through the museum, I will look at the list that I have and I can get back to you on that one. Okay, will that help? Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. For the person who is asking if this section will be recorded, it has been recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. Just mute your.
Mute.
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay, just a little more housekeeping there. Yes. So at this point in time, I want to thank Pat for a very interesting presentation. I think the persons out there, that you have a lot to think about. And you also have some homework where you can go on the website, slavevoyages.org, and try to navigate. As Pat say, it takes a little time to understand, but just go in and see what you can find. So I want to thank you all for being with us throughout the year. As I said, this is our final session for 2021. And I want to thank you for all of your support. All of the sessions that we did in Zoom and previous to that, you can find them on the museum's YouTube channel. If you have any issue finding them, just drop me an email. My email is library@barbnews.org. So I want to thank you all for, again, for being with us and wish you all the best in the upcoming festive season and to stay safe. Our next meeting will be in January and we will have Professor Cobley who will be looking at Barbadian links and Barbadian African links, mainly looking at Barbadians who would have relocated to Africa and built communities there. In fact, our program for 2022 will be looking at those diasporic links. We will begin with the general African connection, then we will go into Liberia. We will be looking at South Carolina. We'll be looking at Shelter Island, Cuba, among others. So you should have a very interesting program for next year. So thanks again, everyone. Thank you, Pat, and stay safe. Goodbye.